Well, Gary, this new book, Making Your Marriage a Fortress, is amazing. And I just want to start
Oh,
by quoting something that you said. When hurricanes hit, which you experienced being in Texas, when hurricanes hit, one of two things will be true for you relationally. One, the state of your marriage will become part of the problem, adding to your woes. Or two, the strength of your marriage will become a refuge against the storm.
yes.
I thought this was so brilliant. Can you just elaborate on how we do have this choice?
Yeah. Well, we don't live in a world that is kind toward marriages. We don't live in a world that helps us maintain our affection for each other. I think it's the opposite. Just the events of life can pull us apart. And when that happens, we're going to have to make two choices. One, will our marriage come out closer and stronger? Will we feel more intimate as a couple? Or will we let our frustration over the situation pull us apart? So I talk to couples where one couple faced more debt than they earned in a year. That tears a lot of couples apart. Why, in their case, did it help them be stronger in their marriages 3 or 4 years later? A couple that had MS, the husband had MS. Again, a lot of couples will divorce in the face of a lifelong, serious, and ever worsening disability. Why has it helped them prosper in their marriage? A couple that lost their only child just before his 20th birthday. And she said, I know 70% of marriages won't survive this. You've got to help us stay together, because they all recognized, look, this is terrible what's
Yeah.
happened to us. But it would be even worse if we have to face this on our own. If it not only takes away our child, but takes away our marriage, not only takes
Yeah.
away our retirement 401k, but takes away our relationship with each other. So it not only takes away, our physical health, but takes away our marital health. So it's just getting people to realize a storm of some kind is coming. I don't know what kind. Could be relational, financial, vocational, related to child rearing. But think about, when the storm hits, how do you grow your marriage instead of being having your marriage being buried by the
Yeah.
disappointment and hurt?
Oh, it's so good. Well, the couple that had MS in that chapter, you talked about how different people have different prescriptions. Like
Yeah.
what helps one person doesn't necessarily help the other. And I think about this when like we have a worship service at our church on Wednesday nights, and I really like it. It's worship and prayer, and I just love it. Like I think it's so rejuvenating. I love it. But my husband, like he doesn't really like it. Now he loves God, Gary, but he doesn't like it. He'd literally rather walk around the church premises talking to God like by himself, and for a long time I would think how awful. Like I'm the godly one. I'm inside the church and you're like walking around the grass,
Yeah.
But this actually helps me talk about that spiritual, medicine that is different for everybody.
Yeah. Well, we actually end the book with that, looking at different pathways. And what you described is one. Some people, they're drawn to God through worship. Some like to get alone. Some do doing acts of caregiving. Some are the activists. They want all the protests or the prayer intercessions or whatnot. They're the intellectuals who say, hey, let's skip the singing and spend 45 minutes in a long sermon, while you've got the enthusiasm. I say, well, how about a 5-minute devotional and 45 minutes of singing?
Yeah.
And just recognizing that we relate to God in different ways, but we're all worshiping, I'm saying, through Christ, the same God. And the key is to learn from each other. When I judge my spouse, how she might relate to the Lord, I'm not learning from her. I'm assuming that I've got it all. And what I know from reading Christian history and the Christian classics and scripture, and just being a pastor for decades, is that God is so big. There's a lot we can learn from the different ways that people learn to love Him and relate to Him. And that strengthens our marriage. Judging the way our spouse worships limits our own understanding of God, and it doesn't help our marriage grow.
Yeah. And with that same idea, if you're trying to make your marriage a fortress, and if you're thinking, well, you're not as spiritual as I am because you don't do it like I do, that is certainly not helping. You also talk about how sometimes one spouse is up and one spouse is down. And I
Yes.
think people have experienced that a lot. Talk about how that can be enjoyed and appreciated.
Yeah. Let me give an example of two couples. I'll do the MS couple and then the couple that lost their child, one being up and down. When Daryl was diagnosed with MS 3 years into their marriage, and Arlene, he was a bodybuilder. He could
Wow.
bench press 400 pounds, which if people don't lift weights,
Mm.
it would take about three of me to bench press 400. That's a lot of weight.
Right.
Um, and he's the classic half glass full spouse. Stacy, his wife, is a classic half glass empty spouse. So she thought, this is terrible, this is awful, this is gonna. And there was Stacy, it's okay. God's gonna be there. And they found out in retrospect, looking back decades later, they were both wrong and they were both right.
Mm.
Stacy was right when she said this was awful because Daryl, as an athlete, thought, look, I'm going to work my way through this. As an athlete, I'm going to keep lifting until the doctor stopped him and said, Daryl, you're doing damage to your body that your body can't repair. You
Mm.
can't pretend you don't have MS just because you don't want to have MS. And
Mm.
Daryl realized he was making it worse by not recognizing the seriousness of the situation. But Stacy needed to learn that it would be all right. In fact, she told me, this is one of the more moving conversations I had for the book, that decades later, she's sitting at a dinner and it's good conversation, great food. Daryl is now in a motorized chair with
Mm.
very limited mobility, and she has to leave early. He just does better if he's in bed by 8:30. But she said to herself, Stacy, see, there's laughter and friendships, and you and Daryl love each other. You're doing okay financially. She goes, all of those years that you were afraid, this is what you feared the most. It's
Oh,
happened and
yeah.
you're okay. And then she looked
Yeah.
at me, Arlene, and she said, Gary, my fear of MS did more damage to our marriage than MS did.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe that statement of faith, but she realized by having a fearful response, she was putting herself in the future without God's grace being there.
Yeah.
And she realized, no, it is going to be a tough future and disappointing, but I won't live 1 second of it without my Father comforting me, providing for us, caring for us. And so they both needed to realize the glass was half empty and the glass was half full. They were
Yeah.
both wrong and they were both right.
Isn't that the truth? That so many times we are both wrong and we are both right.
And then the couple that lost their child that grieved differently was one of the stories in there. Again, I know there are a lot of parents out there, and we think losing a child is one of the worst things we could imagine. Well, imagine losing your only child
Mm.
just before his 20th birthday, and you realize every Mother's Day, I'm never going to hear.
Yeah.
Every Father's Day, I'm never going to get something for my child. There will be no daughter-in-law. There will be no grandchildren. I mean, looking for it was just horrendous. And Janelle admitted, Gary, she was so devastated. She goes, for that first year, it was 95% Joe and 5% me keeping this marriage going. I was just hurting, trying to find my way.
Yeah.
Joe seemed to make it through the first year, but then he was a plaintiff lawyer, had a terrible case. I'm sorry, just awful, godless people. He made a
Yeah.
lot of money, but it just about
Yes.
buried him.
Right.
And so the second year, he really started to lose it. And a lot of people say the second year of grieving is more difficult than the first. The first year's a fog, you're numb. The second year, you're getting used to the new normal. And so he began to fall apart. And Janelle said for the second year, it was 75% me and 25% Joe. And I think she was being kind to Joe. I think it might have been 95%
Yeah.
him and her and 5% him. But it was just helpful to remind each other that when we grieve on a different timeline. We grieve in different ways. Stacy talks about, she was the one who had the husband with MS, the need to lament and grieve. She had to get to the point where, okay, it's not going to be fixed the way I want it to be fixed. So the next spiritual prescription is learning to grieve and lament. And she found that very helpful.
Yeah.
Daryl, who went through this and said when he was diagnosed, his one prayer was two words: heal me, heal me, heal me. Until he sensed God telling him, Daryl, I'm going to heal you, but not of MS. I'm going to use MS to heal worse things in your life. Now, at first, Daryl thought, there's nothing worse in my life
Nothing
than
worse.
MS until God opened him up to some spiritual realities. But Daryl came back, says, yes, we need to grieve and lament, as Stacy says, that's helpful, but we also need to be thankful. And Daryl, this might astonish your listeners. Daryl's one of the more thankful men I know, because he talks about how MS gives me an opportunity to be thankful for my wife because she has to do so much for me
Yeah.
every day. And I had to make a decision years ago. Do I want to be that bitter old cranky dude, or do I want to be a guy who's really grateful for his wife and grateful to the God who gave him this wife?
Yeah.
And so he goes, I may be the most thankful husband in the world because I have 1,000 things to thank my wife for every day. And so
Beautiful. Yeah.
lamentation and grief helped Stacy heal. Daryl found being particularly thankful helped him heal. They're both biblical.
Yeah.
And again, it's accepting that we'll face difficult times, but we need to face it in the way that God leads us through it.